So I am currently working on a structured video about the substance, but I need to get this off my chest. What is Sony doing right now? From the management of every single studio they own, to management of PSN, to the sale of PlayStation 5s and the PS5 Pro and the press of that, going discless and really trying to push that whole agenda, I am amazed that they're allowed to kind of carry on the way they're going and that PlayStation fans are letting them. I was a long-term PlayStation user. I had the PS1 when I was 4 years old, and I've been PlayStation ever since, but that changed a couple of years ago when I got a PC, and I was kind of shifting in between until about probably this time last year, where I was realizing very quickly, okay, so besides Final Fantasy, besides a few games here and there, there's nothing big, there's nothing new coming out, compared to especially the previous gen, the PS4, where there were games almost every 3 months, quarterly at least. And I'm asking myself, what happened between last decade and this decade to the point Sony is burnt out and they seemingly can't even manage to meet the previous expectations of the last generation, let alone the PS3 generation or even the PS2 generation, God forbid. What I seem to keep going back to is the fact that internally there was a massive live service push. They were desperate to have a game like Concord be successful. The studio acquisitions we had between Bungie, between Firewalk and many others, it doesn't make sense. There are so many things they could have done instead with all that money. And even down to the IP they do own, Until Dawn, Gravity Rush. Sorry, my cat's climbing on my food I just ate. Even between the studios they, owned previously, didn't own, but worked with supermassive games, making Until Dawn, Gravity Rush, all of Japan's studio being completely wiped out. That never even made sense in the first place. Okay, sure, maybe their games weren't Last of Us sellers. At the end of the day, games like, any of those PS2 era that were very experimental, I don't know how they expected those games to sell 10 million copies every time. That's not what they were designed to do. They were designed to be experimental. They're still system sellers because it lures people in to try out your games in the first place. Like, I had the iToy on the PS2, and there were so many fun games on that. Super Monkey Ball, I played that on the iToy for hours on end, and I was desperate to play every game since. There's a selling point there, and for some reason, they currently seem to think that that's a thing of the past, that, a kid nowadays won't want that kind of thing. Because 5 years ago, Fortnite was massively successful, and it still is. But even, within the live service businesses, the live service companies and studios that manage to make those and make them a hit, even they aren't meeting their targets anymore because there's so many of them. It's such an oversaturated market. So how you can release Concord 6-7 years after Overwatch and expect to meet those same sales points Overwatch did back then is ridiculous. Compared to, say, Marvel Rivals, that's another thing you can ask yourself. What did Marvel Rivals do differently that sold itself to players? Why are people still on that game but didn't even want to try Concord for free in the first place? And I think, on top of being a very well recognised IP, which is something Sony have complained about, they don't have those, even though they have many, many IP they can go to and create sequels on, or spin-offs, or create something new entirely based around that premise. I think Marvel Rivals did have passion, and even though there are some mechanics in that game that are kind of broken, there are some very overpowered characters, some of the level design is so copy and paste of Overwatch 1, it's still such an enjoyable experience to play, and I think it's something that people have been crying out for. People will spend money on your market if you make something that's fun, not just addictive or trying to be addictive. I think for me, I was kind of asking myself, at what point did this happen? At what point did Sony start to kind of lose me a bit? And I definitely think the last time I can remember feeling kind of, it's great being on PlayStation, there are so many great games. The last time was probably around 2018, 2019, I'd say. It definitely got, I would say, around the end of the PS4 generation, probably because of COVID as well, that suddenly the only two big games that year, if I'm remembering correctly, you had Last of Us 2 and Ghost of Tsushima, and those were the two big games that year. And after that, for a little while there, even though the PS5 launched, and there were some big games that had somewhat of an interest, there was nothing huge for a long period there, to the point I didn't buy a PS5 for a good year until, especially because they were rare to find anyway. But I also wasn't rushing out to get one because there wasn't a game that's crying out for me to go buy it day one. The Demon's Souls remake kind of had my interest, but I wasn't desperate to go and play that game in the first place. I think there are many other games, especially in the Souls genre, that I could have gone to instead and tried out first. The last Souls game I really got into was Bloodborne, and even then I didn't finish it, I must admit. PSN is something that is the reason I went to PS3 rather than Xbox 360, because at the time when Xbox were charging, for their online membership, PlayStation wasn't. And which to me, at the time, just a kid with not much pocket money, I was thinking, hell, I'm going to go for PlayStation just because I don't want to be spending £13 a month. And I also thought to myself, I don't want to make this shit the consensus. I don't want to have to spend that much money every month on a membership. And then PS4 rolls around and that becomes the norm anyway. Of course, mind you can more blame Microsoft for that one, to be fair. But I go back and ask myself, at what point did the script flip to the point where Sony seemed almost, they were very pro-consumer, because I think the initial PlayStation 3 reveal went so poorly. And by the end of that generation, they had turned the market back around. It went back to being PlayStation 3 on top by the end, which is astounding considering the amount of stacked collections the Xbox 360 had. All the Halo games, Gears of War. You had so many good other games, Xbox was spitting out at the time, and PlayStation were too. But I think, conformity was go for Xbox because you've got Halo, because you've got so many games you can play with your friends, and that's where everybody was going. I've always been more of a single player type guy, and because of that, I was still going with PlayStation, just to have games like Uncharted, and beyond that, the experimental games. I really enjoyed Rain, which was a 2013 game, I think, that released on PS3, and that was published by Sony. And this is something I thought about the other day. That isn't on PC, it's not on PS4. It was a really good, small title on PS3. And I don't know if it was by an indie studio or what, but for some reason, Sony have just kept that buried. And there are so many other games they have, legacy titles they can release, that are guaranteed sellers they just won't put out. The Ratchet & Clank collection, you had the first 3 games from the PS2 era re-released as a HD collection on PS3. It's not on PS4. The Future trilogy, which released on PS3, not on PS4. Infamous 1 and 2, once again on PS3 and not on PS4. And there are so many examples of that, and all Sony are trying to do by reviving IP is almost, remakes, full-on remakes, like for example the Until Dawn remake, which didn't even make sense in the first place. All they did was change some of the shots, the visuals, and then also take out the iconic score of the first game, which I don't understand. That's a score that to me is irreplaceable. And the minute you change the tone of Until Dawn, you lose the element of Sam Raimi campiness that made it so good. And that's why I will never buy that remake, because I will miss the tone that was established in the first game. The remake could have maybe, if they brought the actors back in and tried to do something more experimental and different, it might have grabbed my interest. But it's the same game word for word, just shot very differently and with different camera angles, which I don't really want to experience the standard third-person adventure type game. That's not what Until Dawn should be. And on top of that, despite the fact the remake released a year ago, we're now getting an Until Dawn movie this year that isn't related to the game. It's not a retelling of that, it's something else entirely. So I'm convinced Sony made this horror film in the first place and thought to themselves, what can we latch this onto? Until Dawn. Stick it on, slap, there you go. They're making a Gravity Rush film, despite the fact that there hasn't been a Gravity Rush game since 2017, I think the 2 was. And I loved Gravity Rush, both games. And I would much rather a third game than probably a shitty film that's going to be set in America and isn't going to reflect the original story at all. You have to ask yourself, what is the point in this? I think that goes down to Sony's movie studios. That's a whole other load of crap, to be honest, that I also don't appreciate and have no respect for. I haven't seen a single Spider-Man Sonyverse movie since Venom 1 because it put me off so bad. This is probably seem like an old man around here, but I really don't care because I am done with PlayStation, which is such a shame to say. There was a time when I adored PlayStation, and in a way I still do, but it almost feels like a bygone thing. I guess how people look at, Sega consoles from back in the day. We're like, oh, I remember those, and that was so good. But except PlayStation's still walking around here. It's like the ex-girlfriend that you're wondering, what are you doing here? We don't talk anymore. The single-player games that have released in this generation have been quite disappointing, I must say as well. Spider-Man 2, it felt so drained of life compared to the 2018 game. That game was incredible. The story it had was so compelling. Compared to Spider-Man 2, where the missions were awfully paced, the dialogue fell off, every single character had a rushed arc, to the point of Harry being Venom, to the point of Peter having the symbiote. And that's a story we've seen done probably a fair 20 times now. And at least 3 of the cartoons that I watched as a kid did it better than this adult-rated Spider-Man adaptation, which doesn't make sense to me. Tony Todd as Venom, completely wasted. Completely. You had a home run there. You have an iconic horror actor playing Venom. You have a stacked cast in the last game, all ready to go, and for some reason, Insomniac just couldn't deliver. It was still, I'm not saying it's a bad game, it's still a good game, but we go into these games, especially when you hear they've spent 200 million, 300 million, they've spent Avatar level of money, okay, maybe not Avatar level, but close enough, to the point you ask yourself, how are you spending this much money and not making something that is to the level of, say, Arkham City? That's the game that comes to mind to me as the perfect superhero game. To ask any of these studios nowadays for an Arkham City level game, especially within PlayStation, is impossible within a year or 2 or 3 or even at this rate 10, because whether they're working on a live service game and the plug's been pulled, or so many staff get impatient while working in these big studios and they move on to somewhere else that has more ambition, has more drive, you get to a point where any of those studios aren't as they were in the first place. All the people who worked on those big iconic games are no longer there. Amy Hennig at Naughty Dog, that's, however, a topic I won't spiral into, but the way they treated her, to the point that she moved on to other projects when she was established these iconic characters through Uncharted, and even prior to that, Legacy of Kain, all the games she worked on were incredible. Compared to how she was treated by the end, it's awful. One of the previous Sony executives said they're in a bad state, and it's true. When Jim Ryan was in charge and he retired, he had a retirement party in London, and I heard about it through a couple of friends. And not only did he attend this party, he had a picture with everybody on the team, but the next day they were all laid off in the PlayStation London studio. Which, I'm sorry, how much of a dick are you? That is, the most corpo bullshit, that you will go and take pictures with all the people who work at your studios and smile, and they'll say, oh, good luck to you on your retirement, and the next day they're getting laid off. And what, do you think the public won't hear about that? Because people did, and that's something that people won't say it, but it's something that sticks with a player. But to a lot of people who listen to these news articles, who go to these reports, it does mean something, because it's showing an element of disrespect to the people that make your games. You're no longer in it for the people, and for making games, you're in it for the business. And I think the more corporate you become, the less respect a lot of people have, and people like myself do move somewhere else. And there's something to be said about the fact that, say if McDonald's stopped serving food well, if it came out cold, let's be honest, it does come out cold. But when that happens, your customers get mad. There's a bad reputation about your product. If you don't deliver on the product, you're failing the business in the first place. So it's all well and good being for the business more than for the players, but the moment you sell out, the moment you stop being that brand and focusing on what your product is and more on what your business model should be, it affects the overall system you have in place. Whether it is PC or Nintendo Switch, people will go elsewhere, because if you don't keep making games, what's going to keep people motivated to, buy a PS6? It won't happen now. It won't happen, in the next 3-4 years. But over time, people start to have less respect for your brand when you do these shitty things. Like, for example, PS5 Pro. I hear PS5 Pro and I think to myself, okay, this is an upgrade in every single way. But there's no disk drive. And especially after the PSN outage, where we've now established that when these networks go down, it doesn't just lock off your multiplayer games, it will lock off your digitally downloaded games as well, any of them. Say, for example, Red Dead Redemption 2. I might think to myself, oh man, PSN's down, I'm going to launch Red Dead and hop on that and just wander the West for a while. Nope, impossible, because PSN's down. But Red Dead is not a game that requires PSN to play. Doesn't matter, because you bought it through PlayStation and we have to validate the file with which you purchased the game. What? That doesn't even make sense. At what stage did we, stop owning our games? We do have, obviously, times where the digital library is something. It doesn't just exist for a problem with PlayStation. It's a problem everywhere. It's something that, my generation, future generations are going to face. There'll be less preservation of media in general because we're losing all physical media in the first place. But at this point, it's so blatantly obvious to people that you're up to something shady even when PSN goes down for a day and no one can play their games, and then you don't establish what the problem was in the first place, like what happened, that wasn't addressed, compared to the PSN outage in 2011 when that was a bit longer, that was I think 2-3 weeks, was it? It was quite a while. But when that happened, you got free games. I think it was Infamous 1, Burnout Paradise, and there was something else that I can't remember. But at the time, it was a very clear, man, we're sorry that happened, here's some free games. Compared to the state we're in now, where this day outage, what is the compensation? 5 days PSN. Not even an amount you can redeem as a voucher, what you usually pay per month. It's just, 5 days less that you would pay for next month. And that's a joke. That is actually a joke. And not to even address the issue of why PSN went down in the first place. To me, at the time, I was laughing because I'm thinking to myself, if I was still being a PlayStation faithful, I guess, I wouldn't have been able to play any of my games. But I was on Helldivers 2 on Friday night because I bought it on PC and I was playing with all my friends on PC. It's back to that point where I'm like, man, people start to think that as well. The next time, it might not happen for another 2-3 years, when PSN goes out again, but there are people saying, oh, I'm here playing on PC. It might make some kids think, oh, rather than saving up for a PS6, I'm going to save even longer and get a brand new PC. Or I'm going to just build one myself. Even if you have a bit of a worse build, most current gen games you can run. So you have to ask yourself, what is the point? I'm spending the high end, basically the Apple version of like a console. And why am I spending that money when I can just invest in a PC and invest in something that's, for one, it's going to last me longer, and for two, it's something that it's not just for gaming, it is for so many other passions that person might pursue in the first place. Sony just has to sort it out. And I know there's a lot of internal shuffling because I pay attention to every single huff they take. Herman Holst, when he was taking a step down from co-CEO, I think at first I was, oh man, he's out, he's gone. But no, he's now the head of PlayStation Studios, which basically means every time he wants to approve a certain project, he has to go to the CEO, who is like a finance guy in Sony, I think. And he's turned around and said, can we approve this game for this much? And he says yes. Doesn't that prove that this person who was previously in charge can't really be held accountable for those finances in the first place? If he has to be handheld through approving games, should he be in the position he's in the first place? No. But it's another example of he's someone who's in a higher command of power because he's worked up the ranks through Guerrilla Games when he worked on Horizon, to the point of being a CEO, where he doesn't get completely laid off like a lot of these poor people do. He gets to be downgraded a tiny bit because in the CEO world that's such a big scolding. But he deserves worse for the way PlayStation has suffered. Allegedly Concord was a massive push from him. A lot of people blamed Jim Ryan, but it was also Herman Holst who was so keen to get it going and called it PlayStation Star Wars. Like, what a joke. Absolute joke. They're desperate to have like a franchise and IP, but that's not something you can just bring out of nowhere. You need to build it up. You need to do something that has passion behind it, not go to a chart and say, well, people like this and this and this, therefore if we put these things together, we'll make this. No. Take a pitch from a certain audience member, or from staff. Hell, why not let people make their games they want to make in the first place? and then go from there, and then establish, okay, what characters can we introduce that will be interesting to people? How can we resonate with our current generation of audiences? That doesn't cross their minds. What crosses their minds is, how can we get our audience hooked? How can we get them addicted so they're going to spend more and more money on all these live service games? And it's just a scam. It's just all of these massive studios trying to be scammers, because they don't do it in a respectful way where it's all cosmetic. They all try and go the Ubisoft route of, okay, we're going to make this pay to win, which isn't fair. And that's why Ubisoft is currently sinking, because they've treated their fans like shit. And if you do the same thing, like I say, PlayStation's a massive brand, it would take way longer, but over time, people lose respect for you as a consumer. And I know that most companies don't respect their consumers, but they should, because at the end of the day, voting with your wallet is the biggest power you have. And the more time passes, the more they'll look at those charts and they'll think, well, shit, people are moving on. Damn, this was 20 minutes. So I have a lot to say about PlayStation, because I loved PlayStation since day one. I was playing Harry Potter on PS1 when I was 4, Crash Bandicoot, all of those, Spyro. It's astounding to me that we're in such a dire state for this company. There are still people that will defend it for some reason. I don't understand why. I get brand loyalty and whatever, but I think we're in an era now where brand loyalty doesn't exist. We all see through these companies, the way they spoon feed us such blatant lies. They never tell the truth about what they intend for their consumers. They never show their passion like they used to. Reggie Fils made Nintendo. The way he used to market to consumers during Nintendo Directs, just generally, it was so full of life and passion. And, I think some people would see that still as cringy and like executive bullshit, but hell, sometimes it was entertaining, and at least he showed a sense of passion for games, which is more than said for all these out-of-touch old white guys who have no idea how to even play a game, who think they know what consumers want in gaming. And it's a joke. It's absolute joke, man. Oh, God, I'm going to start ranting now. I do think that recent events, Concord being the worst-selling game of all time, and a few other things Sony have gone through, have really changed their position on where to go from here. And I'd love to see them prove me wrong. I'd love to see the studios turn around, bring back great single-player games and unique experiences. And hell, I might buy the PS6 myself. But as it stands, I don't feel like I'm a PlayStation fan anymore. I don't feel as if I can go back to the console when there's so many great indies to play on PC, and there's just so much more to explore and experience. And unfortunately for PlayStation, they've got a long way to go to bring back that trust, at least for me. But each to their own. But if you've listened, thank you very much. I hope I've not left you too mad, like I am.